How's it going, Grace students? Welcome back to Life Groups and our lessons through Colossians. Tonight we will be in Colossians chapter 2, verses 1 and 2, so go ahead and turn there if you are not there already. We will be looking at verses 1 and 2, like I said, but to get some context, go ahead and pause here and read through chapter 1, verses 24 through chapter 2, verse 5. Okay, that's chapter 1, verse 24 through chapter 2, verse 5. Go ahead and pause here and read that together. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and read chapter 2, verses 1 through 3 again. Sorry, something's not quite right.
5 minutes later.
Much better. Okay, chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. I want you to know how hard I am contending for you and for those at Laodicea and for all who have not seen me personally. My goal is that they may be encouraged in heart and united in love. So Paul tells the Colossians in verse 1 that even though he hasn't met them, he is contending for them. He is fighting for them. And when Paul says contending, that's actually a word that would normally be used of athletic competitions. And Paul is saying that he is essentially jumping through hoops. He is wrestling. He is sprinting for the sake of the Colossians. He's striving to preach Christ to them and for them, even though he hasn't met them, okay? If you haven't met someone, it's easy to think they don't really care about you, or maybe they don't understand the specific problems that you face, and that, again, maybe they don't love you like they would somebody that they have met. And Paul is saying, no, you truly matter to me, and you are a valuable part of the global church and part of the movement that is the Christian kingdom that is invading the world, and I am working hard for you. That's what Paul is saying in those verses. Now look at verse 2 with me. Paul says, I am striving to preach Christ for you. Verse 2, now look, verse 2. I am striving to preach Christ to you because my goal is that they, when he says they, he's talking about all the churches, all the Christians that haven't met him. My goal is that they may be encouraged in heart and united in love. So Paul's goal is to emotionally uplift the Colossians and to encourage them and to inspire love in their hearts for one another and for other churches, to show that they are part of something bigger than even just their individual church. I want you to be united in love for all the other Christians and churches in the world. He wants to inspire, again, in their hearts, courage, a feeling of courage and comfort and love that unites them to other believers and other churches. Now, a quick word on our emotions, and actually it's not that quick, but I think this is important. Some of you may not have thought anything of it, but maybe some of you are uncomfortable with me saying that Paul is trying to cause an emotional response in his listeners, in the Colossians to whom he is writing to. Some of you may have heard this idea that love is a verb or love is a choice. Our culture is so emotional and sentimental that our culture has reduced love to only a feeling or only an emotion. And from what I see, I think Christians have reacted against that by saying that love is never an emotion. Love is never a feeling. And I think that's reducing love beyond its fullest meaning. And I think love is used all throughout Scripture in an emotional sense, okay? So love, as it's used in Scripture, is both an emotion and a choice. Many of you have heard me say that love is both a feeling and it's goodwill. It's benevolence. It's choosing to work for the good of someone else. So it's both, I would say, an emotion and a choice, an action. So it's a complex word with a lot of meanings, and we use it in a lot of different ways. And this whole lesson is not going to be on love, but I want you to understand those two parts of love. With that in mind, go ahead and pause here and answer the questions on screen, and maybe that will help you kind of understand this idea a little more fully. Okay, I trust that those questions and that discussion was helpful, and maybe hopefully your leaders and some of your peers were able to help you think through that idea. So to summarize verse 1, I would say that Paul wants to encourage the churches who haven't met them so that they are united in a shared feeling of love for one another, and so that they also choose to love one another. They choose to act for the good of other believers and other churches. So that's what Paul is saying, why he is writing to them and why he is contending for Christ and why he is preaching Christ. Look at the next part of verse 2. Look back at verse 2 with me. It says, so that they may have the full riches of complete understanding, in order that they may know the mystery of God, namely Christ. So that's a mouthful. So to understand verse 2, let me summarize what Paul has said leading up to it, and then explain verse 2 as well. So Paul says at the end of Colossians 1, all the way back in Colossians 1 at the end, that he is working hard. He is striving to proclaim Christ to the Colossians. And then in chapter 2, verses 1 and 2, he says he is doing this. He says he is striving to proclaim Christ. So in order to encourage their hearts and unite them in love, but that's not the only thing he's trying to do. That's not the end of what he's trying to do. He says he is encouraging their hearts and uniting them in love by striving to preach Christ so that they may have the full riches of complete understanding of the mystery of God, which is Christ. So maybe to summarize that a little bit, Paul's complete final end goal for the Colossians is that they would deeply, fully, richly know Christ. So I'm striving to preach Christ to you so that it will inspire a uniting courage and love for one another in your hearts. And I want you to be united in love and courageous, because that will help you fully know Christ. I think that's what Paul is trying to say all the way from the end of chapter 1 to here in verse 2. Now, I want to point out two important things about knowing Christ from these verses. Okay, so again, Paul's final goal is that they would know Christ, and I want to point out two things about that. So number one is that part of knowing is feeling. Okay, so let me explain that. Part of knowing is feeling. I believe this is why Paul appeals to the Colossians' emotions. He wants them to know Christ, not just in an intellectual way, but in an experiential and in an emotional way. Okay, that's the order of and the logic of how verse 2 flows. He wants them to be encouraged, have a feeling of courage in their hearts and love, in order that they know Christ. He wants them to feel what they should feel about Christ. He doesn't want them just to be able to recite facts about Jesus. He wants them to know him in a deep, emotional way, along with those facts and that intellectual understanding of who Christ is. Now, again, I want to provide some balance to all of this. You need to know doctrine and theology and facts about Christ. This is an important part of knowing Christ. But those things, knowing those things intellectually, should not just stay here. They should flow to my heart and shape my emotions and how I feel about him too. As I learn and I understand and I know more about who Christ is, it should cause me to feel awe and amazement and joy and delight when I hear that Christ is supreme over everything and that he is holding all things together. That should do something to my heart, to my emotions, okay? To illustrate these things a little bit, if I feel deep, intense emotions toward my wife, but I can't tell you her family's names, her extended family's names, or what her favorite color is, or I don't even know when her birthday is, I don't know her. I don't know her as a person. I don't know those things about her. The perfect example of this, I think, is what happens to Anna in Frozen. Okay, she meets this Hans and experiences deep, intense emotions about him. She experiences infatuation with him. But she barely knows anything about him, and after only knowing him for less than a day, she decides to marry him, and everyone in the movie and those watching knows that that's foolish, and it doesn't turn out well for her, okay? So that's emotion without knowledge. That's feeling without right understanding. Another example to demonstrate kind of the other side of that, I can read books and articles about the Grand Canyon, and I can know what kind of rock it is made out of, and I can know the history of the exploration of the Grand Canyon. I can know its deepest points and its shallowest point, and I can know all these facts about the Grand Canyon. But I would say that I know the Grand Canyon in a deeper, more profound way when I actually stand on the edge of the Grand Canyon and see it with my own eyes and feel its vastness. And until I experience that, I don't truly know the Grand Canyon. I know that's a little bit weird to say because it's an inanimate object, it's not a person, but I think that illustrates the point. That would be knowledge without experience or without emotion. That would be intelligence without affection or experience. Okay, so that's the kind of balance that we need to bring, and that's what I think Paul is trying to say is part of knowing Christ fully is feeling rightly about him, who he is, and what he's done. One quick warning before we move on. Just because there's so much confusion around feelings and emotion, I want to try and balance some of these things as best as I can. Don't base the quality of your faith on the consistency and intensity of your emotions, okay? Just because you don't always feel a certain way toward God doesn't mean that he doesn't love you or that you are automatically doing something wrong. As Christians, we're not trying to seek constant, intense emotional experiences. That's not what Scripture teaches. Scripture teaches that we should seek to be faithful to God's commands and that we should worship God. That's what we are called to do as Christians. I don't constantly have this deep, intense, burning passion toward my wife. That doesn't mean I don't love her or that our marriage is in jeopardy. But there are times also when I look at her and my heart sings and I feel this intense delight in her and I'm thankful for her in an experiential way, and I'm thankful for those times and that is part of my love for her. Okay? The same is true for Christ. The same is true for Christ as a person and as our God. Okay, I'm going to leave that there, and if you want to pause and ask any questions to one another or to your leaders and try to maybe discuss that a little bit more, you can do that now if you need to, or talk about that more at the end of the video. But anytime we talk about love or emotions, there's just a lot of confusion there, and I hope that's somewhat clarifying or helpful. So to summarize, the first point from verse 2 is that part of knowing Christ is experiencing him in an emotional sense. And those emotions are tied, right, to a correct understanding of Christ. So part of knowing is feeling. The second point that I see in verse 2 is that we know Christ by knowing his people, or part of the way we know Christ is by knowing his people. This includes, right, the emotions, the love you have for his people, and also the choice to love and seek the goodness and the benefit of those people. In verse 2, Paul tells us that he wants us to be united in love with one another so that we will know Christ. That unity, that togetherness, that community that we have in other Christians or with other Christians leads us to a deeper knowledge of Christ. And I think that's because we all reflect Christ in different ways. Some of us embody and reflect Christ's kindness better than others. Some of us reflect Christ's justice better than others. Whatever it is, as you look around your church, you see Christ reflected in his people. We are image bearers of God. An imager is someone who reflects something, reflects an image. We reflect God as people and as Christians. The things that are lovely or praiseworthy about other Christians are small reflections of the same things that are lovely and praiseworthy about Christ. So when you look at someone and think, wow, I love that virtue in them, that virtue in them encourages and comforts me and gives me peace or hope or courage. Again, it's because they are reflecting Christ and the things that are admirable about Christ. So part of knowing Christ, or one of the ways we know Christ, is by knowing his people. And that's why it's so important that you are here tonight. That's why it's so important that you are involved in a local church. That's why it's so important that you have godly Christian mentors and godly Christian friends. Because Paul says that his goal for the Colossians and for all believers is to fully know Christ, and God is gracious to us by giving us people and community, and that helps us to know Christ more deeply, and there's just a joy in that as well. So that is all I have for tonight. I have a few discussion questions for you to finish. May God bless you, and would you be encouraged in heart and united in love for one another, so that you may reach a full, rich understanding of Christ. I'll see you next time.